you want to talk a little bit about what the process was like of trying to score the work, or at least even just sort of your general responses overall to start with?
Absolutely. So I took everything home and I read the rubric. And then what I really like to do is a dry run of reading all of the student responses before I start scoring. I think the rubric is a great guide. The students had their rubric that they used when they approached the task. I had kind of the answer key and the rubric, but I think sometimes if you start grading and scoring and giving numerical values, you get halfway through and realize you've either become a little bit more lenient because so many weren't successful, or become a little bit more stringent because everyone got something that you thought would be more difficult. So you begin looking for a better explanation or more detail. So I kind of like to do a dry read, just see how everything went and see if there's any notations I need to add to the rubric when I'm scoring to kind of keep the equity and limit myself from making kind of too many jumps in terms of leniency or the opposite.
Great. So from that dry run, what are some of the general things you noticed? I'm thinking we might go back to this worksheet that we had in the workshop, you know, and thinking about what were some of the common errors and misconceptions, some of the successful approaches.
Exactly. So when I read through it, I definitely, a couple places went, ooh, no. So they definitely did have some areas of success. The first problems number 1, 2, and 3 were definitely more successful than 4, 5, 6, which we know, and in terms of the formatting, that was intentional. We want to really create that low floor where everyone has equal access to jump into the task. But I definitely saw a lot of really small components that I noticed were holding students back from being as successful as I was hoping they would be. The scores were a little bit lower. So what I'm hoping to do is to reflect on the reasons that those scores may be lower and the students weren't as successful, and then come up with some ways that I can really target those student needs so that they're more successful the next time around on a linear equation problem and even on this specific task. So hopefully today we're going to look at some student misconceptions as a whole group and build a little bit more of their foundation so that they can take another crack at some of these.
Great, great. So I know you mentioned that one of the places where they had some misconceptions was in item 3.
Yes, absolutely.
So do we want to take a specific look at item 3? I think that would be great.
So item 3, I wrote a lot of feedback to the students, and I kept kind of a running list of the things that I saw going on with item 3. Just to recap, item 3, suppose Carlos uses X minutes in a month. Write an equation that links the number of minutes used X to the cost for the month C. C in and of itself became a huge problem for the students. They had y equals mxb up on the board. Both classes both suggested to use that as kind of the general equation format. But y and c, we were hoping they would link as meaning the same thing because we wanted the cost to equal blank based on that independent variable. Well, what happened was as soon as they saw the c, they tried to add it into y equals mx plus b. So they wanted to put the c somewhere too, but they didn't want to replace anything. So just c in general was something that some students struggled with in terms of representation. And then the decimal. You know, this was a specific task around money.
So they forgot the decimal? They forgot that they were talking about
did.
cents in some places and dollars in some places.
Exactly. So, and even in some of the earlier work on 1 and 2, I saw answers in the thousands because they didn't set it up ever as a decimal. So some people saw that 24 cents and literally used it as a 24, which is not incorrect as long as you maintain that the unit measurement is cents. So if they understood that and labeled it cents throughout, then I accepted that as an answer. So if they had written 1,440 cents, which one student did, then I accepted it as a perfectly, you know, their equivalent.
So let's go back to number 3 again then. So the decimals there, where did they run into problems with decimals in number 3?
When they were writing their equation, or some of them just wrote the expression, which was another little bit of a gap that I would want to note. Some of them forgot the y equals or c equals. When I did my dry run, I realized most did not use c who wrote a correct equation. Most used y. And I did make an on-the-spot judgment that I was going to accept that as a full and complete answer. So You know, it did specify that C was to be used, but based on the fact that almost no one was able to use that successfully, and I thought, what am I really assessing here? Am I assessing that they know how to use C, or am I assessing that they know how to write an equation and really infer based on what the problem specified? I said, you know, if they use Y, but they did it correctly, they still get it. They still know how to write an equation based on information.
Exactly, because what you're doing then is basing your evaluation on what you're looking for. And the important thing here is, can they write an equation?
Right, exactly. But yeah, number 3 to me, as I was going over it, was really where I honed in and said, which of the students are understanding the concept of equation writing and how to use them based on you know, word problems and information given, in which students still need a lot of help with that.
Right, but I think you told me that you used sort of that strategy we had done in the workshop where you just sorted into 3 piles, and that was how you sort of got that sense of, you know, these are the ones that totally got it, these were the ones that had some great right ideas, but
Right, so I love that strategy and I use it all the time. I think kind of the old way of thinking was really, let's just look at their overall total. You know, how many got 10 out of 10, how many got 0 out of 10, how many were in the middle around 5 or 6 out of 10. And then once you determine which problems you felt were the best representation of their misunderstandings as well as their successes, then you can kind of do the ranking. So number 3 is where I definitely set the ranking up, and I can kind of just show you how it laid out. All right, so here's our 3 piles, low, medium, high. In the low, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. In our medium pile, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so a little bit less. And in our high pile, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So definitely a range, starting with more in the low end and less in the high end. But if you put the medium and highs together, it does balance out to be a little bit higher than the low. So that's encouraging, actually. That's really encouraging. It was clear when I read their answers to 5 and 6 that we really did have common understanding and background knowledge of what the task overall was about. They understood the concept of using data and internet. Everyone seemed to have that as kind of an equal way to start the playing field. But when I read 5 and 6, I think they relied a little bit too much on their background knowledge of data usage, and they weren't able to justify their answers with mathematical reasoning.
Right, so many of them gave the correct answer for which plan would be better at that point, but they didn't support their answer.
Exactly. So what I ended up writing for a lot of them, you know, here's an example of a partial credit and 0 credit. This one did show some math, but it was incorrect. For example, Carlos' choice was wrong because he spent more money than he really needed to with a different plan. I think that he should go with the monthly plan because it is much cheaper than the unlimited plan. Again, I wrote how much cheaper, and really it's only $4 cheaper, so much cheaper is kind of an exaggeration. But a lot of students understood that there was a difference in the cost overall, and that $160 was a really high price to pay per month if you weren't using a lot of data. So a lot of them, in their own words, expressed to me that concept of it's only worth it if you use a lot of internet. It's only worth it if you use a lot of data. But I didn't see any math that showed me that that was in fact correct. So that's another thing I really want to hit today when we're in the classroom is, I agree with you, but how do you know? I agree with you. You know, I wrote little notes to students, use mathematics to defend your answer. Be exact, how many minutes? So trying to show them when they get an opportunity to work on this again, that it wasn't that they had incorrect thinking, it was that they couldn't justify it appropriately. And that's really where, you know, with this deeper level of understanding with Common Core, we need them to be able to justify. We need them to have not just an overall conceptual understanding of, in general, this is better than this. We want to know specifically why. The other thing on top of analyzing each question in terms of that low, medium, high that I find useful for any task that I do with students is also keeping in mind that concept of universal design for learning, the UDL principles. A lot of times I look at this before I even design a task or when evaluating a task and whether or not I want to use it with students. But I also look at it again when I want to go for what's coming next. What kind of lessons do I want to develop, mini lessons or reteaching for students? And then especially surrounding number 3, I really saw engagement and representation as the 2 areas of UDL that I wanted to focus on.
What does this close look at student work in general, so not necessarily referring to this specific task, but for you as a teacher or educator, what's the value?
Oh my goodness, everything. I think this is doing these types of tasks, whether they're 6 problems or 1 problem or an exit card. I think using this process with students lets you as a teacher know so much more than you ever knew before. Plugging in a grade into your online grade book and knowing that half of your students didn't get above 50% just tells you that they didn't get it. And I don't want to focus on what they didn't get other than to help inform my own instruction. I want to focus for them on what they did understand to help continue to build them up. But I also see all of these formative pieces as ways for me or the teacher to get better in the classroom. Having the information of looking at not just low responses, but why are they low?
Right.
Not just medium responses, why were they medium responses? Not just high responses, but why were they high? How were they so successful? How can we share the success that they had with others?